Welcome. I am Patricia Cranz, Director, of the OPC. Tonight, we are delighted to host a panel discussing Newshawks in Berlin, a new book that delves deeply into how the Associated Press covered Nazi Germany. Research by the authors uncovers fierce internal debates about how to report on a dictatorship and reveals decisions by AP that sometimes prioritize business ambitions over journalistic ethics. Two AP veterans, Larry Heinzerling and Randy Herschaft, worked together to report and research the book. Heinzerling was a reporter, foreign correspondent, and news executive during a 41 career at the Associated Press. He worked in foreign bureaus in Nigeria, South Africa, and Germany, and served as director of AP World Services and deputy international editor. Herschaft has been an investigative journalist at the AP for 3 decades. He was a member of the AP team that won an OPC Award, a George Polk Award, and a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting, which uncovered nearly 50 years later a massacre of civilians by US troops during the Korean War. Randy's interest in Germany and the Holocaust run deep, and Uncle Solomon Sachs disappeared in France during World War II. The family never learned details of his fate until 1983, when Randy and his mother saw Solomon's name in a book listing train convoys that transported Jews to their death. Solomon was sent to Auschwitz and never heard from again. 2 decades later, Randy took on an assignment that resulted in the AP series, The Holocaust Papers, that detailed his long struggle to open Nazi records in the archive of the International Tracing Service. Among the 50 million documents was the file on his uncle, Solomon Sachs. Larry Heinzerling died in 2021. His wife, Ann Cooper, worked with Randy to complete the book. Ann was a bureau chief for NPR in Moscow and Johannesburg. She was also the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists and a journalism professor at Columbia. Sorry about my dog. Our moderator tonight is someone who knows a thing or two about covering dictatorships. Andrew Nagorski is a journalist and author who spent more than 3 decades as a foreign correspondent and editor for Newsweek, serving as bureau chief in Hong Kong, Moscow twice, Rome, Bonn, Warsaw, and Berlin. In 1982, the Soviet government, angry about his reporting, expelled Andy from the country. Andy is also a prolific author who has written several books about Germany, World War II, and the Nazis. His latest book is Saving Freud, The Rescuers Who Brought Him to Freedom. Others include 1941, the year Germany lost the war, The Nazi Hunters, and The Greatest Battle, Stalin, Hitler, and the Desperate Struggle for Moscow that changed the course of World War II. Randy, Ann, and Andy will talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll take questions. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat at any time. I now turn it over to you, Andy.
Thank you, Patricia. It's really good to be here. These OPC, whether virtual or in-person gatherings, always feel a little bit like family reunions, journalistic family. Today, I think it's there's also some literal family, at least among people who I think are tuned in. For instance, we have Kitty Thurmer, who's the daughter of Angus Thurmer, one of the AP correspondents who are featured in the book, and who I had the good fortune to meet and interview about 12 years ago. Kitty is on the call. She told me she would be, and a couple of her siblings maybe as well. Also, we have Jerry Whiteleather. His father, Melvin Whiteleather, was also one of the correspondents who is featured in this book. And I believe also that Irina Shirer is on the call. She is the widow of William Shirer, who was not AP. He was a CBS correspondent in Berlin during most of the 30s, and of course then went on to write books like The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. So I welcome everybody with certainly with those kinds of connections, and everybody else who's on the call. This is a topic which I think touches a lot of lives, and while you say, oh, it was a long time ago, it wasn't that long ago, as one can see by the personal connections here. So one of the most daunting challenges for any journalist is to report from a totalitarian society. And that's true of the journalists, it's true of the bureaus. And one of the hardest assignments, I think, also for journalists is then to examine the record of their own journalistic organization in that context. Newshawks in Berlin, the book that we're talking about, tells the story of the AP bureau in Berlin during the Third Reich, which was certainly one of the most difficult places to work at that time or at any time. The only comparable place I can think of in that era, of course, was Moscow in the Stalin era. So we have this challenge of looking at the record of the Berlin Bureau, and I think Larry, Randy, and Anne have done a truly masterful job in examining the evidence, pulling the story together, and making it both really a riveting narrative while covering an awful lot of ground. So I congratulate you for that. Randy, I'd like to start with you. Can you just give the basics? How did this project start, which turned into a very ambitious project? And then how did you and Larry start the research on it?
Okay. So it was a bombshell that hit the AP offices and startled its staff. In 2016, German historian Harriet Schonberg wrote that AP ceded influence to Nazi propagandists over its German photo service from 33 to 41. She also noted that the Nazis misused AP photos to further the regime's virulent anti-Semitism. And she revealed for the first time AP's use of photos from a dedicated Nazi photographer, Franz Roth. So immediately, John Denishevsky, AP's vice president of standards, felt that it was important for AP to do an accounting to see what actually transpired, because all this was new to us. Larry had spent 5 years as a bureau chief in Germany, and this was new to him. And all of AP's official published and non-published company histories didn't reveal or depict any of the writings that Harriet wrote about. So we spent the year researching the report, and at the conclusion, we felt that it was only a partial. The mosaic wasn't complete. There was a lot more material out there, and we wanted a complete, full accounting of what transpired. So Larry and I worked for the next 4 years in developing our first comprehensive reporting of a manuscript. And then Anne came in, and she was very involved in the editorial process, and she did a great job summarizing everything, because we had like twice as many words as we cut it down, and she made it a much more readable form. As far as the research, which is always fascinating, we utilized AP corporate archives, which when we did the book, they received more material from Berlin, which was a little ironic, but but to our fortune, because we were able to report new nuggets of information. Also, the memoirs and personal papers, the diaries of the participants. So like Jerry Whiteleather contributed his father's memoir, which was very helpful to us. The Wisconsin Historical Society is one of the most prolific journalist repositories. 4 of the AP Newshawks donated their personal collections to that organization. Louis Lochner, his diaries are there, and strangely, they stop in June of 45 when the story got more interesting. Steinkopf papers were there. He embedded and was the first like Western journalist to visit Warsaw, and so there's a lot of good material for him. Ernest Fisher was another Newshawk who donated his papers, and one thing that we was startled with, we came across in his private diary anti-Semitic entries, and we were startled about reading that, and then we wondered, and we did investigation about how that might have interfered with his reporting on the Jews in Berlin, which he covered. And Byron Price was another AP. He was an AP executive. He became the director of censorship. He okayed the AP photo deal during the war, and he's fascinating also because he was the only censor to receive a Pulitzer citation. So there's incredible wealth of material there. And
there's certainly, you can see it saturates your pages. So you can see it's based on really extensive research and good research. And as you say, it's not just what the AP produced, but what was behind the scenes and what people were writing privately.
Just one other item. So AP cooperated. They gave us kind of exclusive access to the AP Photo London Library, because a lot of the AP photographs from Berlin that were not destroyed were transferred over when AP the photo agency was sold in 2009. It was transferred to London. So I was able to be there for a whole week to investigate many thousands of photographs that they had that we were able to incorporate in our report.
All right. Well, Anne, you write in, I think, your introduction that the AP is one of the most important but least understood news organizations. What do you mean by that? And in particular, what was so special about the Berlin Bureau? Just by way of a small footnote here, when I was researching my book about that period of Hitlerland, I was astounded to see that in the 30s, there were about 50 U.S. correspondents in Berlin in the 30s. Of course, it was the big story of the day, but they were representing all sorts of news organizations, most of whom don't exist anymore. So what was it about the AP that was so special and about the Berlin Bureau?
Yeah, well, AP in that era, through the Nazi era, had about a half dozen foreign correspondents there all the time. And there were 2 other, United Press and International News Service were also American wire services there, and they had multiple people. Yeah, there were a lot of correspondents there. Nobody was as important as AP, and it's kind of hard to grasp now just how important it was, but there's no internet, there's no TV in the 30s or through the war. Radio is in its infancy. And so in America, where were you getting your news? You were getting it from your hometown newspaper. And odds are very good that your hometown newspaper was an AP subscriber. Even if it was like the New York Times had a correspondent there, they still subscribed to AP to get news from all over the world. AP had about 1,200 subscribers, American newspaper subscribers throughout that era. And just, to give you an idea of the impact, Randy was looking at, so what were the biggest circulation newspapers in that time, and Chicago Tribune was the biggest or one of the very biggest. They, reached 1 million subscribers a day. Well, AP with these 1,200 newspapers from big to, Podunkville, they could reach potentially tens of millions of readers every single day. So just think about the scale of that. But just one important point about that reaching, the potential to reach that many people. AP is not a publisher. They were not a publisher then. The Wire went out, it carried the stories. Editors at every single subscriber paper are looking at that wire and deciding we're going to run this story or we're not going to run it. Or, we're going to run it, but we've only got room for the first 3 paragraphs. Or, wow, this is amazing news. We're going to slap it on page 1, whereas another paper is going to put it on page 10. So how those stories got played was, there were sort of 2 levels of gatekeepers, the AP editors and then the editors at the subscriber papers, which meant that, how one individual story was played could look very different across the country. One example we give in the paper is in 1942, Rabbi Stephen Wise of the World Jewish Congress told AP that his organization and the US State Department had confirmed, they felt confident saying that that the Nazis had killed 2 million Jews at that point, and it's like late 1942. And that Hitler's goal was to kill all of the Jews in Nazi-held Europe by the end of that year. That story ran on page 1 in a bunch of places. It ran on page 6 in the Washington Post and was a couple of paragraphs. It ran on page 10 in the New York Times, which reported the 2 million killed number, but didn't say, and they have the goal of eliminating Europe's Jewry by the end of the year. So things could play very differently. And much has been made of, well, if the New York Times was putting it that far into the paper, is that saying, we're not really sure that this is accurate, but we're going to run it? So, how things got played could influence how people saw the stories.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's true today. But as you say, with the AP sending out these reports, but then so many other people making decisions about the play they got, that the impact could be very, very different. Now, this was, AP was that big player. The biggest player in the AP Berlin Bureau was Louis Lochner, the bureau chief. And he is he won a Pulitzer in '39 for his coverage of Germany, but he was also a very controversial character. Tell us about Lochner and what kind of a bureau did he run and how did that influence the coverage? Randy, okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Maybe Randy, you want to take a first shot at that?
Okay. Lochner was, if there was any constant for foreign correspondence covering Berlin, it was Lochner. He was there from 1924 to 1941. 6 years he was president of the Foreign Press Association, 3 years for the American Germany Chamber of Commerce. He had his origins are from Germany. He was proficient in Germany. He had many contacts in the German field. He was plagued because his reporting indicated to some that he was pro-Nazi. His reporting, in which he was criticized by some at AP, Lynn Heinzerling, said that he wasn't a very good writer because he wasn't brought up in the AP School of Journalism, where you come from America first and then and learn the discipline of how to put together a story. And then he was blamed for being the messenger by some, that that he was reporting German victories, and he was just the messenger. But then he was accused by others of being enthusiastic and reporting, you know, the German like propaganda lines. But he was the most, I think, the most important journalist. He in 1932 he predicted that the Nazis were going to be a plague for the Jews. He vigorously and aggressively reported on all the anti-Semitic incidents during the whole time. He reported in 39 about the liquidation of the Jews by Hitler. Even a sidebar story to that, he had, it mentions up top that Hitler was predicting the extermination of the Jews should there be a war. And then in 41, before he left Germany, he reported on the wholesale deportations of 2 million Jews to Eastern Europe, where the Jews were taken in the middle of the night in these cold freight cars to an unknown destination. So I'm very proud of his and other of the AP correspondents. Jerry, if I can just mention Melvin Whiteleather, who Jerry's son is here. He was very courageous in his reporting. He wrote a story about 2 million Nazi party members who were informing on their neighbors, and he wasn't afraid to write this. But unfortunately, it's believed that because of the stresses of the job that he and everyone else faced every day, that he may have come home with post traumatic stress syndrome.
Yeah,
So
let me-
Lochner,
yeah,
Lochner,
Yeah, go ahead.
so
Well, I
Lochner
just,
had
yeah, go ahead.
Lochner had to walk a tightrope with no net, because he also had to answer to the AP gatekeepers in New York, who didn't like that he was burying leads. So one of the fascinating aspects of Lochner was the self-censorship. So to get around reporting negative things on the Nazis, the way he did that was to bury it. I'm sorry, to bury it in the story. And
Well,
New
the other
York
thing, I mean, I think that self-censorship is, I mean, aside from the particular stories and how they play, that's the issue, which of course comes up for any reporter in that kind of situation, because overt censorship is in a way easier to deal with. You know, somebody else is making the decision, but
Mhm.
you did not in Germany then have overt censorship of the news side. The photo side, that was something else, and the broadcast, that was something else. And so Lochner was making this case. I remember asking Angus Thurmer about this, one of his young reporters. He said, you know, Lochner basically told us, go out and report these stories as best you can, but don't jeopardize the Bureau. Well, that's a tough balance. Anne, you wanted to jump in here?
Yeah, so there's this famous Lochner line. It is more important that we stay in the field, and so that is how he justified the self-censorship. You know, everybody on the print side had to self-censor to some degree. You can look at some of the calls that Lochner made and say, well, come on, you know, you really pulled your punches there. But as Randy pointed out, you know, everything got reported, maybe not as robustly as it would have been, you know, had there not been censorship. But it's not like we didn't know about violence against Jews, that we didn't know about the ghettos, the concentration camps. You know, all of those stories were reported, and Lochner, you know, sometimes used language like I don't remember his exact sentence, but in his lead in Kristallnacht, you know, it's something like, you know, the greatest anti-Semitic action against Jews in modern times. You know, he was reaching for that kind of analytical language that would tell people this was really, really, really awful. So yeah, he was walking a tightrope. And you're absolutely right. Self-censorship is the worst. The Germans called it, for print, responsibility censorship.
Yeah.
You wrote, you submitted your story, it got published, and German diplomats were reading the newspapers in the US and elsewhere and reporting back to Berlin. So, if they didn't like something that got in print, you could get called in or you could end up getting expelled. Um, and it's very insidious. And for photos, you had to submit them, you had to get this blue stamp that said, okay, you can send this out of the country. And for radio, William Shire had to hand in his scripts, and presumably they went through, this is very much like the Soviet Union, went through, edited, cut stuff out, and then said, this is what you're reading. So that's also insidious, but it's a lot clearer than responsibility censorship was.
Well, it's interesting. The Soviet regime got rid of direct censorship of foreign correspondence in 1961. So all of us who came after had this, there was a question, people, you could see some people debating, how far do I go and what can I do and what not? And as you say, it's insidious because you start thinking that way, you almost sometimes censor yourself more than maybe the censors would. But photos was a very different situation. But just getting back to one before I want a few words on photos, but before we do, just a reminder to people, feel free to toss in questions here. We'll get to them in a moment.
The AP News Bureau did suffer a tangible repercussion on reporting stories in 1935. There was a ban government-wide on them issuing releases and interviews to AP because of some stories that AP published. So there were tangible repercussions that AP did incur in this.
Well, the discussion always was, for instance, Edgar Maurer, the famous Chicago Daily News correspondent, who was another very, very prominent correspondent of that era, was driven out of Germany in I think it was September of 33, once Hitler took power. And the question was, I think you have a quote in the book saying, where Lochner is saying, well, he could afford to be kicked out because he only represents one paper. We represent all these publications. Well, it's that's an interesting point, but it also gets to the point which I guess if we go back to the photos here, maybe Randy, you can show a couple of photos and see some of the decisions that were made.
Okay, so this first photo, Chad, if we can get the first photo up. So this photo represents Lochner's caution in deciding not to buy this freelancer photo of a Jewish attorney being paraded through the streets in Munich in March 1933, as early as within a few weeks of Hitler ascending the chancellery. So this is an example of self-censoring by Lochner, that by him fearing expulsion, that he wrote to New York that he feared expulsion or the closure of the AP News Bureau and photo service. And this was a highly controversial decision. The next photo. So Kristallnacht was one of the biggest pre-war story in Nazi Germany. And perhaps no other event better illustrates the difficulties of reporting on the Nazi dictatorship in pre-war Germany than Kristallnacht. AP got out, so the photos were censored to go out. So the only photos that the editor was able to get out were pretty much like harmless photographs. So they were modest photographs that went out due to Nazi censorship. You'll notice that, well, all the photos only depict destruction of Jewish property, but none show the violent assault on the Jews. But these photos were influential in telling in illustrating the story that Lochner and the staff wrote. A number of these photos are considered iconic photos because there were only very few photos that came out to illustrate Kristallnacht, and Life magazine featured these photos in their magazine, praising that these were the only few that were able to come out, and they did have an impact. And then President Roosevelt recalled the American ambassador, and the American public was very critical of Nazi Germany of this, and it swayed Herbert Hoover and William Randolph Hearst, came to change around their opinion of the Nazis through the stories and the photographs. But let's see, one other thing here.
There's one more Kristallnacht
Yeah.
photo after this
Okay.
one.
Oh, but it didn't change the opinion of whether to allow Jewish refugees into the country. I think there was a bill at the time to allow 10,000 children to emigrate, but there was still an anti-Semitic sentiment in the U.S. So, like Anne writes in the forward, that AP can really inform, but we can't legislate policy, but it did. But the photos and the stories did have an impact. So this is the next picture. So this is a pretty interesting picture, and then we write about this in chapter 1. There's a mystery that surrounds this picture. This is a picture that AP distributed in 1938. But the picture AP distributed did not have the 3 security men in the top right side of the picture. This was photo cropped out in 38, and only while on a research visit to the AP London Library in 2018 did we come across this uncropped version, which was never published before, which showed the 3 security men in the top right side. So, but it's not known why, or it's not known when or why the officials were cropped out of the version AP sent to its subscribers in 38.
Okay.
And the last picture, number 4, this is a fascinating photo by the AP photographer Batz. When Germany invaded Lithuania in July 41, when Jews were getting slaughtered in the countryside and herded into the ghettos, he snapped a photo of the Jews with the letter J on their backs. And then eventually these people, the Jews in the ghettos would be wiped out by within a few months. But Batz wasn't aware, or was far removed from where we believe that where the Jews were getting slaughtered in the countryside at this time. So the key difference between the AP Photo Bureau and the AP News Bureau is that there was censorship in the Photo Bureau. There was not it was self-censorship with the news. So with the photos, unfortunately, the Nazi Ministry of Propaganda, they decided what photos went out. But the key issue here is that the photos that AP distributed to German subscribers, AP kind of took a blind eye. They allowed them without any criticism, that they allowed the Germans to rewrite the captions to foster their propaganda lines.
Yeah.
And this is something that AP took note of in its report in 2017, and said that they didn't protest then. They should have protested, and they'll protest now if that ever happens, when AP's photos or its captions are misused to impugn AP's integrity.
Okay, well, thank you, Randy. I think that's we're starting to get some questions, so I'd like to get to them. I just one quick follow-up, because when, for instance, that photo from 1933 was not, Lochner held it back, but the Hearst News photo service did use it. I'm not sure if they had any consequences, but at the end, at least at the end of the the Third Reich. By that time, I think only the AP photo operation was allowed to continue. So is that just that accurate?
Yeah, well, the others folded. The others had gone.
Yeah.
And it's the continuation of the AP photo operation is a complicated story.
Right.
It basically ended up being kind of run out of or under the auspices of the German foreign ministry, and photos were being moved back and forth from Germany to Portugal and to AP in Portugal using the German diplomatic pouch. And this is when Germany and the US are at war with each other.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the war, there were two military investigators from the US who did a full investigation of how this exchange had worked through all those years, and wrote up a report that suggested that the US Justice Department consider charging AP with trading with the enemy because of this exchange using the German diplomatic pouches. That ended up, as far as we know, being put in a drawer. There were no charges. We don't know exactly why, but that was the most controversial thing, I think, that out of this whole operation that was going.
It's a controversial story, and it's a complicated one, but as you describe it well in the book. This gets to actually one of the first questions from the audience. It's someone's asking, to what extent in writing about this, or about the 30s and 40s, did you struggle with the question of historical context and not imposing today's standards or expectations on that period? How would you respond to that?
I want to say something about that. I can't quote you exactly, Andy, of something that you wrote in the introduction to Hitlerland, but it really hit home for me. And you said something like, I'm not going to sit here in judgment of these people. I'm presenting what they said, what they wrote, and this isn't meant to say this guy was terrible, didn't recognize anything, whatever. And I thought and I think, Larry and Randy both said this. We want to present how this unfolded, what decisions were made, how were they made? Sorry?
Yeah, I think you did that very well. I think, I mean, that's definitely was my philosophy in writing about it, but I felt it was, that it's so easy to judge in retrospect.
Exactly.
And to say, I would have understood, I would have done this or that. Unless you're in those situations, I'd be a little hesitant about that. But it's important to understand what they were going through and then what they ultimately decided, or decided to push or not to push.
And I wouldn't say the book is without judgment. There certainly is a lot of analysis in there, but as you say, who are we to say, well, if I'd been there, I never would have done X, Y, Z. So.
Right. And another question is, what access did the AP and other US journalists have to top Nazis, Goebbels, even Hitler? I think, well, you can respond to that because there are very specific examples of that in Lochner and others. But Randy, do you want to respond on
that? You would have thought that if Lochner was pro-Nazi, that he would have been given more interviews with Hitler. So he wasn't really used as a mouthpiece by Hitler. He had two significant interviews with Hitler in 32 and 34. And one of the unorthodox policies that he had that may be typical in the 1930s of the previous question was that he was of the opinion to allow the subject he interviewed to edit the interview, so that when he put forth his the Q&A with Hitler, Hitler withdrew his comments on the Jewish question, that Germany wasn't able to. He didn't want the Jews because they weren't able to integrate within Germany. So for some reason, you know, Lachlan not only with Hitler, but allowed other top government officials to edit his stories. But he had a great relationship with Goring. He was very close with Goebbels. He was familiar with all of them. He would have a lot of social events, social parties, and he'd invite the top party dignitaries. So
Your point, by the way, of how this process of what was in Germany called authorization, that you interviewed somebody and then you gave them the text back so they could do it. It was interesting when my first posting in Germany in Bonn in the mid-80s, a lot of German journalists were still doing that, and some American journalists and others were following that procedure. And when I said, I was fine with having them check if I was translating a direct quote that it was accurate, but I'm saying you're not editing this. But that habit persisted for a long time, and I think not just in Germany, in some other European countries as well. But of course, it becomes a lot more sinister when you're dealing with a Nazi regime.
Right.
But all right, there was a question here from Arlene Getz about AP's coverage and how it compared to Reuters. I know why she's asking about Reuters. She used to work at Reuters. But good question about how it could, but there are a couple of questions about how it compared to other news services, because there was also the International News Service, which was the Hearst News Service, and wasn't there, and United Press.
UP, yeah.
And it's worth pointing out, by the way, that United Press, one of their correspondents, who was Richard Hotelet, who later became CBS, and he was the only American reporter in that period in 1941 who was held by the Gestapo for a few months.
Yeah.
If I can chime in, so one of the unique things about this book is that we have a chapter devoted to the Holocaust and how AP reported the Holocaust as it unfolded, and we compared it to other news outlets and what they reported. Also, it was important that we had the competition because it kept AP on its toes. UP, there was a lot of competition. UP was known at the time for publishing a lot of sensational stories, outlandish rumors. So like Lochner would get called to the fire because the gatekeepers would be saying, how come we're not keeping up with UP and what they're saying? But a lot of it, but they would report sensational rumors and stories, and AP would have none of that. But one thing that resulted from that, which is fascinating, is that AP created a column called the Rumor Deflator, which would do a fact check on the veracity of these outlandish rumors. But it was short-lived. It was Ken Cooper who killed the feature after only running for 1 month.
Actually, there's a question about Ken Cooper and about who was his position was general manager, right? Or I forget.
Yes.
Yeah, and his relationship with Lochner and how that influenced the coverage. I mean, again, that's one of those complex inner workings of a news organization. But in brief, Anne, how would you characterize Cooper's stance on these issues?
On the journalistic issues, or
Yeah, well, yeah, on how the Bureau should handle these, these very touchy issues. And Randy, your point about UP having the reputation of being sensationalistic, but remember also a lot of people initially rejected stories about the Holocaust and so forth, saying it couldn't be true. And on a rational level, it felt too absurd and too horrific to be true, and that happened in Britain and the US. And so the boundary between sensationalistic and just accurate in this case was often very thin.
Yeah, so that relationship between Cooper and Lochner is really, really interesting. And thank goodness there was no internet and email then, because these guys wrote long, long letters back and forth to each other. And, Cooper he was a huge figure in American journalism, also controversial. He was an isolationist, certainly for a lot of the early part of the war. And he was full of wonderful rhetoric about, journalism and democracy, and the Associated Press bringing the truth to the world. He was trying to expand AP as a business, and he used this kind of rhetoric in doing that. But the sense that I got was basically he was a businessman at heart, and Lochner understood that. And so Lochner, in making his argument, that it's more important for us to stay in the field than take risks and get thrown out, he was always throwing that back to Cooper. Like if we, on the first photo that Randy showed, the lawyer being marched around with his pants cut off and he's been beaten up and stuff, and Lochner didn't buy that photo. And so Hearst bought it, and it ran in the Hearst papers. And you can imagine the photo editors in New York are apoplectic, and they send this rocket message to Lochner. And he responds and he says, "You should be darn glad we didn't buy that, because we'd be out of business today, if we had bought that picture and run it in America." And you hear that over and over from him, and he knows that resonates with Cooper, and will keep Cooper backing him up. Yes, they do need to self-censor. It's okay. Calm down, everybody. Leave their copy alone. There's some story got changed with when Lochner had buried a lead way down in a story. They moved it up, and he angrily writes to New York and says, "You can't do that. You're putting us in jeopardy." And Cooper, of course, backed him all the way and basically said, "Don't touch their copy." If they buried the lead, they had a good reason for doing it.
Yeah, there's actually a question here about editors in New York and the AP being whether they were skeptical about the Bureau's reports. But here it's actually the opposite syndrome that you're talking about, where they're trying to play up the more, let's say, colorful and damning evidence. And there's also a question here from Bill Holstein about the use of Jewish sources by correspondents, by the AP correspondents. Randy?
Okay, I'd like to take that question.
Sure.
So as far as within AP, I'm not familiar that AP had Jewish correspondents here. Okay, he's talking about American Jewish correspondents.
Well, there are two questions I think that came through, if I read them right. One was, were there American Jewish correspondents there still? There certainly were in the 20s, and whether in the AP Bureau, and then Jewish sources for AP reporters.
Okay, so the Jewish correspondents that were there were represented by the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. That was the AP for Jewish newspapers. I believe Harry Smaller was based there in the 30s. Unfortunately, I feel it was a mistake. AP had terminated its agreement with the JTA. I think the JTA was reporting a lot of what was happening during the Holocaust, and I feel that, well, it wasn't only AP, but the New York Times also discontinued its coverage with JTA. AP discontinued its coverage because they did a survey among bureau chiefs, and they felt that they were getting the news without the JTA. They were getting the same news. But I feel that on a daily basis, one can see all the beyond relief tales that were coming out. And if you triangulate these things from many sources, then it becomes hard not to believe that these things were happening. So unfortunately, AP didn't subscribe to JTA at the time. And one of the aggressive things that the JTA did, and we write about this in the book, that when the journalists were interned in 42, the military attaché had them conduct a survey, a questionnaire of how to conduct propaganda against the Germans, and they said not to talk about the Jewish question, that that wouldn't be good. So the JTA saw this, that there was resistance within the general media. So what they did was very clever. They created an alternative, non-Jewish facing news service called the Overseas News Service. They hired non-Jewish employees, respectable writers too, who wrote about these issues that the JTA was writing about, but wasn't getting any traction in the general media. But when the Overseas News Agency would write about it, for instance, they reported that there was a massacre, the Babi Yar, one of the biggest massacres of Jews. So they wrote an early story on it. And because it came from the Overseas News Agency, the Boston Globe picked that up. So that it's
I
so-
just want to get back also to
Yes,
the question. I'm not sure we answered it, about Jewish employees in the Bureau. There were Jewish employees in the photo operation at first, but they were, as you explain in the book, were all were dismissed, had to be let go. That was demanded by the Nazi regime. The AP did dismiss them, but as you also point out, it was still early enough. They seem to have gotten most of them out and jobs elsewhere. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and there's an important distinction. So there were two AP entities there. One was the News Bureau, which was just kind of a classic foreign bureau, and then the photo operation, which was actually a German registered company. And so that was subject to all of these German laws, the anti-Semitic German laws that were being passed. And so when they said, German media cannot have any Jewish employees, they'd applied to the AP photo operation. And Lochner has described, fighting that for a while and saying, oh, but I really need these people. They're essential to our operation. But, eventually he had to cave in. People were let go. He says that he helped some of them get to the United States. And Randy, you know the precise numbers here. They all got out of Germany, but not necessarily to safety. Willie Jacobson, for example.
So there was 6 of them total. One of them was transferred to Paris. Jacobson wasn't allowed to work in Germany anymore, so AP sent him to work in the Austria bureau until the Germans came in 38 and then locked him up with no reason. Then the AP sent him outside the German Reich to Czechoslovakia, to which the Germans then invaded, and then he went back to Berlin. One interesting thing in the book was we're not aware that he was a Kristallnacht photographer. We don't know what happened to him when he got back to Berlin after he came back from Czechoslovakia in 38. But one of the fascinating captions on the back of one of the Kristallnacht photos is like his initial on there. They would put the AP initials of the photographers, and there was only one Kristallnacht photograph that had an initial, which was J, which was on all his other photographs that he did from in Berlin and Vienna. So it's interesting to think if he came out the night of Kristallnacht to snap some photos.
Yeah,
but
all 6 of them survived the war.
Yeah.
And and I think the 5 you pretty much knew, but then Willie Jacobson was the one that it took a lot of research to find out, because he was in East Germany after the war.
Right.
So limited contact with him. But Randy finally found the traces and uncovered, he had a photo agency there, and he resumed a career, but in East Germany. And he had a little bit of contact with at least one former AP employee during that period.
Mhm.
Which-
And
Go ahead.
so
Yeah.
the former Jewish employees, Leon Daniel and Alfred Eisenstadt, created the PIX photo agency when they left AP and came to America in 35. The PIX agency hired refugees, but AP also used them as a source to counteract Nazi propaganda. Like, for instance, Franz Roth painted a varnished version of the Nazi occupation of France getting back to normal. But then AP countered that with photos from PIX, the agency with former Jewish employees of AP, that counted the varnished version of France. And that must have given satisfaction to these Jewish employees that AP was publishing their photos. I think that's an interesting side story.
Since we're running, we'll probably have to wrap up fairly soon. A couple of sort of wrap-up questions, which is one, was Cooper at the end, was he convinced that this photo deal was worth it, since it kept the AP in the photo business in Germany when everybody else was out? And by the way, it's worth pointing out that, as you do in the book, that there was a high AP executive in London, Gideon Seymour, who had actually advised to cut, to pull out, that it was not worth the price. In retrospect, how was that viewed by Cooper and others? Did they continue feeling that they had made the right calls?
I think we don't really know that for sure. But I think, to the extent that Cooper did understand, we're not even entirely sure who knew exactly how this thing operated. There's AP executives said, well, we told the US Censorship Office about this deal and they approved it. Well, the documentation that exists of that indicates that they gave a very skimpy explanation of what was actually going on. They never mentioned the German diplomatic pouches being used, for example. They just said, from time to time we get photos from the front, they're German photos, but they come to us via Portugal. And are you okay if we take those and if we, send some back? And that was approved. Was there skimpy description to be, deceptive to get the approval, or did the executives not really understand how the whole thing worked? I don't think we know that.
And
But
also,
it is clear that the photo deal was very important to Cooper as a business deal, part of that scheme of, I'm going to bring truth to the world, text and photos to the entire world via AP, which had been a very America-centric organization.
and it was also, there was a financial incentive, right?
Yes,
Yes, yeah.
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, these are, we started by saying we're not going to judge in retrospect, but do you have any you want to judge in retrospect? You want to give your 2 cents? I think, Randy, you made very clear your feeling, for instance, that Lochner made decisions that you felt were quite defensible. How about you, Anne? How far do you want to go with that?
Yeah, well, I think the photo operation you can pick apart, and we've, Randy has mentioned Franz Roth. We could spend another 30 minutes on him. He was the Waffen SS photographer who was also off and on the AP payroll, and he was somebody who some of the executives at AP said, why do we keep rehiring this guy? So there were voices out there trying to say, we should be more careful. Why are we hiring a Nazi photographer? And I guess I wish those voices had been listened to some more.
Yeah, and then just on the other part of it, the news operation, which was a a different operation, the battle of self-censorship. How do you think, your 2 cents worth, was the self-censorship to the right degree, or was it over, or did Lochner and others go too far? What's your own feeling on that?
I think Lochner could have pushed the envelope more than he did. I think he probably knew that too, but we weren't there. We weren't facing those decisions. And I think the really striking thing was how much did get reported, and I don't
What
think we've
happened?
gotten enough credit for that.
Right.
And what did you say, Ian?
That AP has not gotten enough credit for how much they were able to report, despite all the censorship and restrictions.
Right. I found some of the AP staffers, like Melvin Whiteleather and others, and even the German national who worked with the staff. He wrote an unveiling story about how there's no free press, that thousands of German publications were terminated, and only Nazi propaganda publications exist. And he wrote that story without a byline. And like I mentioned, Jerry Whiteleather writing the story about the army of 2 million Nazi party members who were informing on their neighbors, I think was very courageous. But I'm proud of how AP reported up until 41. The questionable thing was the photo deal, and transparency, because there wasn't enough. I feel there wasn't enough transparency on the photo captions to identify the sourcing. When the photos were disseminated in Germany to the German media, the photos identified that these were PK information, PK from the PK propaganda company. They clearly identified, but when it was published in the US, it didn't clearly identify the source. It didn't say it was from PK propaganda companies, and there was an AP editor's note saying that you don't have, when it's clear where the photo is from, you don't have to say German sources say, you don't have to say the origins of it, which could make it murkier. But I'm very proud on the News Bureau. And then there are a lot of issues, baggage with the photo, because Cooper clearly prioritized commercial, the commercialization and the business over journalist ethics with the photo deal.
Okay. Well, Randy, Ann, thank you so much. I think there's obviously a lot more we could talk about, but I think you've really laid it out. I hope all of you will read this book. It's Newshawks in Berlin. It really does give a sense of the times, the place, and the personalities very well. So thank you all, and thanks for everyone who attended. I tried to get to, I think, most of the questions. If I missed yours, I apologize. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.